The quiet meaning of effort. Effort rarely announces itself. It does not knock loudly or demand attention. Most of the time, it slips into a day unnoticed, like a habit you no longer remember starting. You wake up, do what needs to be done, and move on. Nothing remarkable happens. Yet somehow, this is where most lives are actually shaped. When people talk about hard work, they often imagine intensity. Long nights, visible struggle, a kind of heroic exhaustion that proves something important is happening. But effort, in its most honest form, is usually quieter than that. It looks ordinary, it blends into routines, it wears comfortable clothes and repeats itself without complaint. There is something slightly disappointing about this when you first realize it. You expect effort to feel meaningful every time you apply it. You expect some internal signal that confirms you are on the right path. Instead, you get silence. The work still needs doing tomorrow, regardless of how you feel about it today. This is often the point where people get confused. They assume that if effort feels dull or repetitive, it must be wrong. They look for motivation, for inspiration, for proof that this particular stretch of work matters. When none of that shows up, they start to question the whole thing. But effort was never designed to entertain us. Long before effort became something to optimize or brand or celebrate online, it was simply how things got done. Fields were planted, tools were repaired, skills were passed from hand to hand. Most of that work left no record. No one clapped for it, and yet it built the structures that allowed everything else to exist. There is a kind of honesty in that. Effort did not need to be meaningful in the emotional sense. It was meaningful because it sustained something: a household, a craft, a community, sometimes just a single person trying to make it through another season. In modern life, effort often carries an extra burden. It is expected to justify itself. If you are working hard, you are also expected to feel fulfilled by it, or at least to believe it will lead somewhere impressive. When that belief wavers, effort begins to feel heavy in a different way. You might notice this on days when the work goes fine, but leaves you strangely empty. Nothing went wrong. You did what you planned to do. Still, there is a quiet question lingering in the background. Is this really worth it? That question does not mean you are failing. It means you are paying attention. Effort, when sustained over time, exposes you to yourself. It reveals how you behave when no one is watching, how you treat tasks that do not immediately reward you, whether you can tolerate boredom without turning it into self-doubt. Most people underestimate how demanding that actually is. It is much easier to work hard when there is urgency, a deadline, a crisis, a visible opponent. Urgency narrows your focus and carries you forward. Quiet effort offers no such structure. It asks you to show up without drama, to continue without a clear emotional payoff. This is why effort is often mistaken for discipline. Discipline sounds rigid. Effort is softer than that. It bends. It adapts. It sometimes looks unremarkable from the outside, but it keeps going. If you look closely, you may notice that effort changes texture over time. In the beginning, it feels conscious. You have to remind yourself why you are doing what you are doing. You have to push through resistance. Later, effort becomes less visible. It settles into muscle memory. You no longer think about it as effort. It becomes part of how you move through the day. This transition is rarely celebrated, even though it matters more than the dramatic beginning. There is also a quieter truth that rarely gets mentioned. Effort does not always lead to success. Sometimes it leads to competence. Sometimes it leads to understanding. Sometimes it leads to the realization that something needs to change. None of these outcomes are failures, but they do not fit neatly into the usual stories. That can feel unsettling. We are taught to associate effort with guaranteed progress. When progress is slow or invisible, effort starts to feel misplaced, as if it is being wasted. But effort is not a transaction. It is not a coin you insert into a machine with a predictable return. It is closer to cultivation. You prepare the ground. You tend to what you can. The results arrive on their own schedule, if they arrive at all. This is not meant to be discouraging. It is meant to be grounding. When effort is freed from the obligation to impress, it becomes more sustainable. You stop asking it to carry your identity or prove your worth. You let it be what it is, a way of engaging with something you care about, even when that care feels faint. You might notice that the most steady people you know rarely talk about how hard they work. Not because they do not work hard, but because effort has become normal to them. It no longer needs narration. It no longer needs justification. There is a quiet confidence in that, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that shows up consistently. This does not mean effort should be endless or unquestioned. There are times when effort becomes a way of avoiding reflection, a way of staying busy instead of honest. Quiet effort still requires occasional pauses, moments where you look at what you are sustaining and ask whether it still deserves your energy. But those questions tend to arise naturally when effort is steady rather than frantic. When you are not constantly chasing intensity, you can actually hear yourself think. In that space, effort becomes less about pushing and more about staying. Staying with a process, staying with uncertainty, staying long enough for understanding to deepen. It is easy to overlook this version of effort because it does not photograph well. It does not produce dramatic before and after moments. Its effects are cumulative and subtle. You notice them in how calmly you handle setbacks, in how little you need external validation to continue, in how your work begins to reflect you rather than your anxieties. Effort, in this sense, is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing the noise that keeps you from becoming more yourself. This may sound abstract, but it plays out in very practical ways. You return to the task even when it feels flat. You do not abandon the day just because it did not sparkle. You allow yourself to be average while you are learning. You trust that repetition is doing something even if you cannot yet name it. Over time, effort becomes less exhausting. Not because it requires less energy, but because it no longer fights you. It aligns with how you actually live, rather than how you think you should live. There is a quiet relief in that alignment. Effort stops being a performance and becomes a relationship, one that changes, sometimes frustrates you, occasionally surprises you, but ultimately stays with you, not as a demand, but as a companion. And when dreams eventually enter the picture, they do not arrive as sudden visions. They grow out of this steady ground. They borrow their shape from the effort that has already been happening. That is the quiet meaning of effort. Not that it guarantees anything, but that it prepares you for whatever comes next. Dreams before they had a name. Long before people talked about goals or ambition, they still carried something forward in their minds. It was not always clear. It did not always have words, but it existed as a quiet pull towards something slightly better than the present moment. A safer place, a fuller table, a life that felt a little less fragile. These early dreams were not written down. They were not announced. Often, they were not even consciously acknowledged. They lived in choices, in patience, in the decision to keep going when stopping would have been easier. It is tempting to imagine that dreaming is a modern habit, that it arrived with leisure time and self-reflection. But dreaming came first. It had to. No one would have planted a seed if they could not imagine a harvest. No one would have taught a child a skill without picturing a future where that skill mattered. Those early dreams were practical, but they were still dreams. They were acts of imagination applied to survival. What changed over time was not the presence of dreams, but the language around them. As societies grew more complex, dreams became more visible. They acquired names. They turned into plans. Eventually, they became identities. Somewhere along the way, dreaming started to feel louder. Modern dreams often arrive fully formed. They come with images, timelines, and expectations attached. You are encouraged to describe them clearly, to commit to them publicly, to measure yourself against them. This makes dreaming feel active and impressive, but it also makes it fragile. Older dreams were harder to break because they were not so specific. They were flexible. They adapted to circumstances. They could survive disappointment without collapsing entirely. You can still see traces of this older style of dreaming in people who work patiently towards something without talking about it much. They may not call it a dream. They might call it getting by, or improving things slowly, or doing what makes sense. But underneath the modest language, there is still a quiet picture of a future that feels worth reaching. These kinds of dreams do not demand constant attention. They do not need to be refreshed every morning. They sit in the background and influence decisions gently. They shape effort without exhausting it. This is very different from the pressure many people feel today to always know what they want, to articulate a vision clearly and confidently, to answer questions about the future without hesitation. That pressure can make dreaming feel like a test. If you hesitate, it seems like you have failed. If your dream changes, it feels like inconsistency rather than growth. But dreaming has always been allowed to be vague. In fact, vagueness was once its strength. When a dream is not pinned down too tightly, it can evolve. It can absorb new information. It can survive setbacks without being disproven. Many people carry dreams that are still unnamed. They sense that something matters to them, but they cannot yet describe it clearly. This is often mistaken for confusion or lack of ambition. In reality, it is a very old and very human state. Before a dream can be spoken, it has to be lived with. There is usually a long period where a dream exists only as a feeling, a slight restlessness, a curiosity that keeps returning, a dissatisfaction that does not have a clear complaint attached to it. This stage is uncomfortable because it offers no clarity and no reassurance. But it is also where dreams become personal. When dreams are given to us too quickly, they tend to belong to other people. They borrow their shape from trends, from success stories, from expectations that sound reasonable but feel oddly distant. These dreams are easy to describe and hard to sustain. Unnamed dreams move more slowly. They take shape through experience rather than imagination alone. They are informed by effort, by failure, by boredom, by small satisfactions that reveal what actually matters to you. This is why it often feels easier to work than to dream. Work gives you something solid to do. Dreaming, especially in its early stages, offers only uncertainty. In earlier times, uncertainty was accepted as part of life. The future was unpredictable by default. Dreams did not promise control, they offered direction. Today, dreams are often asked to provide certainty. We want them to guarantee that our effort will be rewarded, that our choices will make sense in hindsight, that we will not regret the time we invest. But dreams cannot do that. The older understanding of dreaming allowed room for loss and adaptation. A dream could be partially fulfilled. It could be transformed into something smaller or quieter without being considered a failure. It could even be set aside temporarily without disappearing. This flexibility made dreams resilient. You might notice that the dreams that stay with you the longest are rarely the ones you announced confidently at some earlier point. They are the ones that kept resurfacing, even when ignored. The ones that adjusted themselves to your life instead of demanding that your life rearrange itself immediately. These dreams often feel humble. They do not promise transformation. They suggest continuity, a way of living that feels more aligned, a rhythm that feels sustainable. It can feel strange to trust such understated dreams, especially in a culture that celebrates bold declarations. But understated dreams have a long history. They have carried people through generations of uncertainty without burning them out. There is also a quieter truth here. Not all dreams are meant to be achieved. Some exist to orient you, to influence the choices you make along the way, rather than to be completed like a task. When dreams are treated only as goals, they lose this orienting function. They become finish lines. Once crossed, they leave an unexpected emptiness behind. Older dreams did not end so cleanly. They faded gradually. They transformed into new priorities. They left traces in habits and values rather than trophies. This does not make them weaker. It makes them more integrated. If you listen closely to your own thoughts, you may notice dreams that you have never officially claimed. They show up in moments of quiet satisfaction, in the kind of work that absorbs you without effort, in the things you defend instinctively when they are threatened. These dreams do not ask for permission. They do not wait to be validated. They operate quietly, shaping your sense of what feels right. It is easy to overlook them because they do not feel ambitious. They feel familiar, almost obvious, but familiarity is often a sign of depth. Before dreams had names, they were not separate from life. They were woven into it. They did not stand out. They guided. There is something worth remembering in that. Dreaming does not have to be loud to be real. It does not have to be precise to be meaningful. Sometimes it is enough to notice where your attention naturally returns and where your effort feels less forced. Those places often hold the beginnings of a dream, even if it never introduces itself properly. And maybe that is how dreams are meant to begin. Not as declarations, but as quiet companions that walk alongside effort, shaping direction, long before anyone thinks to ask where you are going. The daily weight of showing up. Showing up is not dramatic. It does not feel heroic. Most days, it feels like a small, steady pressure that settles on you the moment you realize the day has started. Not heavy enough to stop you, not light enough to ignore, just there. This is the part that rarely gets described honestly. The weight of showing up is not the work itself. It is the decision to begin again when nothing feels particularly different from yesterday. You wake up with roughly the same thoughts, the same doubts, the same quiet hope that maybe today will feel clearer. Often, it does not. The idea of showing up is usually presented as a single act. You either do it or you do not. In reality, it happens in fragments. You show up to the first task, then to the next. You show up again after a distraction, again after a mistake, again after a moment of resistance that you did not plan for. By the end of the day, it can feel like you have been carrying something invisible for hours. This weight is subtle enough that people question whether it should feel this way. They assume that if they were doing the right thing, it would feel lighter, more affirming, more aligned. When it does not, they begin to suspect that something is wrong. But the weight itself is not a warning sign. It is a feature. Showing up asks you to place your body and attention somewhere specific, even when your thoughts are scattered elsewhere. It asks you to accept the current state of things without waiting for them to improve first. That acceptance carries weight because it removes escape routes. You cannot pretend you will start tomorrow when you have already started today. This is why showing up feels heavier at the beginning of something new. You are not yet accustomed to the shape of the effort. Everything requires intention. Even small actions demand focus. Over time, some of that weight shifts into routine, but it never disappears entirely. There is always a moment where you have to choose presence over avoidance. Most people do not avoid work because they are lazy. They avoid the feeling that comes with beginning. The moment where the day stops being abstract and becomes specific, where expectations narrow, where responsibility quietly settles in. That moment happens every day. It is easy to romanticize consistency from a distance. It sounds clean and disciplined. From the inside, it feels repetitive, sometimes dull, sometimes faintly uncomfortable, especially on days when you cannot see any progress. Those are the days when the weight of showing up feels unnecessary. You wonder if skipping one day would really matter. You consider whether the effort you are making is proportional to what you are getting back. These questions are not a problem. They are part of the process. Showing up does not require enthusiasm. It requires willingness. A quiet agreement to participate even when your emotional state is neutral or resistant. This is difficult because we are taught to wait for the right feeling before acting. But the right feeling often arrives after action, not before. The daily weight exists partly because showing up disrupts your internal negotiations. It interrupts the part of you that wants certainty before commitment. It replaces that certainty with experience. Experience is heavier because it is real. When you show up consistently, you start to notice patterns, not just in the work, but in yourself. You see which tasks drain you faster than expected, which ones absorb you quietly, which excuses repeat themselves, which doubts appear reliably at the same point in the day. This awareness can feel uncomfortable. It removes the illusion that everything would be easier under different circumstances. You begin to see how much of the difficulty travels with you. That realization adds another layer of weight. Not because it is discouraging, but because it is clarifying. There is also a particular kind of tiredness that comes from showing up without feedback. You do the work. You complete the tasks. Nothing obvious happens as a result. No praise, no visible shift. Just the quiet sense that you have done what you said you would do. This tiredness is different from burnout. It is not depletion. It is a kind of mental fatigue that comes from sustained attention without reward. Many people mistake this for a sign that they should stop. In some cases, stopping is the right choice. But often, this fatigue is simply the cost of continuity. It is the price of not resetting your expectations every day. Continuity builds slowly. It does not announce itself. It accumulates in small adjustments, in slightly better decisions, in fewer false starts, in a growing familiarity with the terrain of your own effort. You rarely feel this happening. You notice it later, when something that once felt heavy now feels manageable. This is why showing up feels heavier before it feels lighter. There is also a quieter aspect to this weight. Showing up limits your ability to idealize the future. When you are actively engaged in something, you see its imperfections clearly. You see how much work remains. You see how uneven progress actually is. Fantasy is lighter than reality because it does not resist you. When you show up, you trade fantasy for friction. That trade is worth it, but it is not free. The daily weight reminds you that you are dealing with something real, not imagined. This is especially true when showing up becomes private, when no one is watching, when there is no immediate consequence for skipping a day. The weight then comes from integrity rather than obligation. You show up because you said you would, because you recognize that momentum is fragile, because you know how easily days slide into weeks when left unattended. This kind of showing up builds a quiet trust with yourself, not the loud confidence that comes from success, but the steadier confidence that comes from reliability. That trust matters more than motivation. Motivation fluctuates, reliability accumulates. Over time, the daily weight changes character. It becomes less about resistance and more about gravity, a natural pull toward continuation. You no longer need to convince yourself as much. You simply step into what is already in motion. But even then, there are days when the weight returns, when showing up feels awkward again, when doubt resurfaces without a clear cause. These days do not mean you are moving backward. They mean you are human. Consistency does not eliminate resistance. It teaches you how to carry it. The daily weight of showing up is not something to conquer. It is something to recognize, to respect, to work with rather than against. When you stop expecting it to disappear, it becomes easier to manage. You learn to start gently, to allow yourself a slow entry, to accept that some days will feel heavier than others for reasons you may never fully understand. This acceptance does not make you passive, it makes you patient. Showing up day after day is how effort becomes real, not through intensity, but through presence, not through force, but through repetition. The weight you feel is not holding you back, it is anchoring you. It keeps you connected to what you are actually doing, rather than what you imagine yourself doing. And in that anchoring, something steady begins to form. Not excitement, not certainty, but a quiet sense that you are where you need to be, even when the day itself offers no proof. Hard work without applause. Most hard work happens where no one is watching. Not because it is secret, but because it is ordinary. It takes place in quiet rooms, early mornings, late afternoons, and unremarkable hours that do not invite an audience. This kind of work does not create stories that travel easily. It leaves no clear moment to point to and say, this is where it happened. Applause prefers conclusions. Hard work lives in the middle. There is a strange adjustment that happens when you realize this. At first, you may still expect some kind of response, a sign that what you are doing is visible, a nod, a reaction, something that confirms the effort is landing somewhere outside yourself. When that response does not come, the work can start to feel slightly unreal. You wonder if it counts. This question is rarely asked out loud, but it sits quietly beneath many routines. People continue working while carrying an unspoken uncertainty about whether their effort is being recognized in any meaningful way. Over time, that uncertainty can either harden into resentment or soften into something more stable. The difference is not the amount of work done. It is where the work is being anchored. When effort depends on applause, it becomes fragile. It needs regular reinforcement. It waits for permission to continue. In the absence of recognition, it begins to stall. This does not mean the person is weak. It means they are human. Attention is powerful. Validation feels like fuel, but fuel that comes from outside is unreliable. Hard work without applause forces a shift. Slowly, often uncomfortably, you begin to ask different questions. Instead of asking who noticed, you start asking whether the work itself still feels honest. Instead of wondering how it looks, you begin noticing how it feels to do it. This shift does not happen quickly. At first, the lack of recognition feels personal. You interpret silence as judgment. You assume invisibility means insignificance. It takes time to see that most people are simply absorbed in their own efforts, not actively ignoring yours. In truth, there has always been far more work than applause. Entire lives have been built on effort that never received acknowledgement. Skills refined quietly. Responsibilities carried consistently. Problems solved without ceremony. These efforts did not disappear just because no one clapped. They became foundations. Invisible, but necessary. In modern life, visibility is often mistaken for value. What can be seen feels more real than what cannot. But reality does not operate on that principle. Most systems depend on unseen labor. Most stability is maintained quietly. This includes personal stability. When you work without applause, you start to notice subtler forms of feedback. You feel the work settling into you. You notice how your reactions change, how your tolerance increases, how certain decisions become easier because you have practiced them repeatedly. These changes are not impressive from the outside. They do not make good summaries, but they are real. There is also a particular honesty that emerges when applause is removed from the equation. You are less tempted to exaggerate progress, less inclined to perform effort rather than engage in it. You do not need to frame what you are doing as meaningful. You are free to let it be what it is. This freedom can feel uncomfortable at first. Without external affirmation, you are left alone with your reasons. If those reasons are borrowed or vague, the work will start to feel hollow. If they are grounded, the work will settle. This is one of the quieter functions of unnoticed effort. It tests motivation without announcing that it is doing so. Working without applause also changes how you measure time. Without milestones or celebrations, progress becomes harder to track. Days blur together. Weeks pass without obvious markers. This can feel disorienting. You may wonder if you're moving at all, but something else happens in this blur. You stop resetting yourself constantly. You stop starting over. Continuity replaces novelty. Familiarity replaces excitement. This is where endurance quietly develops. Endurance is not dramatic. It does not surge. It does not inspire speeches. It grows through repeated exposure to uncelebrated effort. Through learning how to continue when nothing is pushing you forward except habit and intention. This kind of endurance cannot be rushed. It cannot be trained quickly. It emerges only when work is allowed to be ordinary. There is also a gentler side to working without applause. Without an audience, mistakes lose some of their sting. There is less pressure to be impressive, less fear of being seen failing. You are allowed to be clumsy, to revise, to learn slowly. This privacy can be protective. It creates space for growth that would be difficult under constant observation. Over time, you may notice that the desire for applause does not disappear entirely. It softens. It becomes less urgent. You still appreciate recognition when it arrives, but you no longer need it to continue. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you steadier. The work itself becomes the reference point. You know what you have done. You know what remains. That knowledge does not depend on anyone else's reaction. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that shows up as calm persistence. You stop needing to explain yourself as much. You stop checking whether your effort looks reasonable from the outside. You trust it because you have lived with it. Hard work without applause also reshapes how you see others. You become more aware of the unseen effort around you. You notice patience where you once saw passivity, consistency where you once saw nothing at all. This awareness can be humbling. It reminds you that most people are carrying more than they reveal, that competence is often quiet, that dedication does not always advertise itself. In this way, unnoticed effort builds empathy. It teaches you to respect work that does not announce its presence, including your own. There will always be moments when you wish someone would notice, when silence feels heavier than usual. These moments do not mean you have chosen the wrong path. They mean you are human, working in a world that cannot acknowledge everything at once. Applause is limited. Effort is not. When you allow yourself to work without constant recognition, you align with a longer rhythm, one that is less reactive, less dependent on timing and attention, more connected to continuity and care. This rhythm does not promise visibility. It offers stability, And stability, while rarely celebrated, is what allows most meaningful things to last. Dreams that shrink and dreams that grow. Dreams do not stay the same size. This is something people rarely mention, even though almost everyone experiences it. A dream begins large, sometimes vague, sometimes dramatic, and then quietly it changes. It adjusts to reality. It responds to effort. It reacts to disappointment. Over time, it either grows deeper or grows smaller. Both movements are natural. In the beginning, dreams often arrive inflated. They are filled with possibility rather than detail. They promise transformation. They suggest a future where things make sense, where effort is rewarded clearly, where identity feels settled. These early dreams are powerful not because they are accurate, but because they give direction. They point somewhere. As time passes, effort begins to interact with the dream. Reality enters. Constraints appear. Skills develop unevenly. Some parts of the dream start to feel unrealistic. Others feel more important than expected. This is usually where the first adjustment happens. The dream shrinks. This shrinking is often misunderstood. It feels like loss, like compromise, like giving up on something that once mattered. People worry that by adjusting their dream, they are betraying their earlier selves. But dreams are not contracts, they are living ideas. When a dream shrinks, it usually becomes more specific, less abstract, more grounded. It sheds the parts that were never really about you. The borrowed ambition. The dramatic image that looked good from a distance, but did not fit up close. This kind of shrinking can feel disappointing at first. The dream no longer sounds impressive. It no longer justifies itself easily. You may hesitate to talk about it. You may even question whether it still counts as a dream at all. But something else is happening beneath the surface. As the dream becomes smaller, it often becomes more reachable, more honest, more aligned with how you actually live. It begins to connect with daily effort rather than sitting above it as an ideal. This is not failure, it is refinement. At the same time, other dreams begin to grow, not in size, but in depth. They develop roots. They attach themselves to values rather than outcomes. They become less about arrival and more about direction. These growing dreams are quieter. They do not announce themselves. You notice them gradually, through preference and repetition, through the kind of work you return to even when no one is watching, through the choices you defend instinctively. Growth in dreams rarely feels exciting. It feels steady. A dream that grows in this way does not need constant reinforcement. It does not rely on fantasy to survive. It is supported by experience, by familiarity, by the quiet knowledge that this matters to you, even when it is inconvenient. This is why some dreams survive disappointment while others collapse. The collapsing dreams were held up by expectation alone. The surviving dreams were connected to effort. There is often a period where shrinking and growing happen at the same time. One version of the dream fades while another takes shape. This can feel confusing. You may feel as though you are losing ambition while also becoming more committed. From the outside, this looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like clarification. You stop chasing scale and start paying attention to substance. This shift does not always happen voluntarily. Sometimes it is forced by circumstance, a limitation, a responsibility, a realization that time and energy are finite. These constraints are often framed as obstacles, but they also act as filters. They remove what cannot be sustained. What remains after this filtering is usually quieter, but stronger. It fits inside your life rather than demanding that your life revolve around it. It allows for rest, for relationships, for complexity. Dreams that grow in this way stop asking you to prove yourself constantly. They stop demanding visible progress at every step. They allow periods of plateau. They tolerate pauses. This tolerance is essential because effort is rarely linear. One of the most difficult adjustments is accepting that some dreams need to shrink permanently. Not because you were wrong to have them, but because they belonged to a different version of you. Letting go of these dreams can feel like erasing a future that once felt real. There is grief in that. Even when the dream was unrealistic, it carried hope. Releasing it means releasing a certain image of yourself. But holding on to a dream that no longer fits can quietly drain energy. It keeps effort misaligned. It creates tension between who you are and who you think you should be. Shrinking a dream can be an act of care. It creates space for something else to grow, often something less dramatic but more enduring. People rarely talk about this because it does not fit the usual narrative. We prefer stories where dreams only expand, where ambition accumulates, where growth is always upward and outward. But real lives move differently. They expand in some areas and contract in others. They trade intensity for depth. They exchange scale for stability. This does not mean dreaming becomes smaller in spirit. It becomes more concentrated. A concentrated dream has weight. It influences decisions quietly. It shapes effort without demanding constant attention. It does not need to be revisited every day to remain present. You might notice this in how your definition of success changes. Early dreams often focus on outcomes, achievements, recognition. Later dreams care more about conditions, how you work, how you live, how you feel while doing both. This shift can feel like settling, but it is often the opposite. It is a move away from abstraction and toward reality. Dreams that grow in depth rather than size are harder to explain. They do not translate well into simple statements. They resist timelines. They do not promise clarity. But they offer something else. They offer continuity. You can live with them for a long time without burning out. They adapt as you change. They remain relevant even when circumstances shift. This is why people who appear modest from the outside often feel surprisingly grounded. Their dreams are not absent. They are integrated. They no longer need to defend them. Shrinking and growing are not opposing forces. They are part of the same process. As one layer falls away, another takes hold. As spectacle fades, substance emerges. The challenge is trusting this process without interpreting it as loss. It requires patience. It requires letting go of the idea that dreams must always look impressive to be valid. It requires accepting that maturity changes ambition, not by removing it, but by reshaping it. In the end, the dreams that matter most are rarely the ones that stayed exactly as they were. They are the ones that survived adjustment, that endured contact with reality, that grew quieter and stronger at the same time. Those dreams do not ask you to become someone else. They ask you to become more fully who you already are, and they tend to stay with you. Not as pressure, but as orientation, a steady presence that guides effort without demanding explanation. Myth of the overnight moment. The idea of the overnight moment is strangely comforting. It suggests that effort accumulates quietly and then suddenly becomes visible. One day you are unknown, unnoticed, unsure. The next, everything clicks. Recognition arrives, momentum takes over, life changes course. This story is told so often that it begins to feel inevitable, as if effort is merely waiting for its cue, as if progress is delayed, not gradual. As if patience will eventually be rewarded with a clear turning point you can point to and say, that was it. But most lives do not unfold that way. What usually happens is far less dramatic. Effort spreads itself thin across time. It leaks into days rather than concentrating in moments. When change arrives, it does not announce itself. It blends in. It looks ordinary. You only realize later that something has shifted. The myth of the overnight moment persists because it simplifies complexity. It turns long, uneven processes into neat stories. It gives people a clean explanation for outcomes that are actually messy. It removes the middle. The middle is where most of the work lives. In the middle, progress is ambiguous. Some days feel productive, others feel wasted. You repeat actions without knowing whether they are accumulating or canceling each other out. You cannot measure momentum reliably because it does not move in a straight line. This uncertainty is uncomfortable. It creates a constant low-level doubt. You wonder if you are late, if you miss something, if others are moving faster because they understand something you do not. The idea of the overnight moment offers relief from this doubt. It suggests that all the confusion will eventually resolve itself in a single reveal, that your effort will be validated in one clear instance. But effort does not work that way. Effort changes things incrementally. It shifts conditions rather than producing events. It alters how you respond, how you decide, how you persist. These changes are internal before they are external, and internal changes are difficult to observe. This is why people often feel unprepared for visible success when it does arrive. From the outside, it looks sudden. From the inside, it feels strangely familiar. You have already been living in its shape for a while. What looks like an overnight transformation is usually the result of long exposure to repetition, to error, to boredom, to quiet persistence. The myth also creates unnecessary pressure. If you believe in overnight moments, you begin to look for signs that one is approaching. You interpret small wins as signals. You become hyper-aware of timing. You start to wonder whether now is the moment everything should change. When it does not, disappointment sharpens. This disappointment is not about failure. It is about expectation. You expected effort to behave like a switch. You expected a payoff that arrived all at once. When it did not, effort started to feel misleading. But effort was never promising spectacle. It was promising continuity. Another consequence of the myth is impatience with the present. If you believe that the real moment is still ahead, the current phase begins to feel like waiting, like a holding pattern. You tolerate the present rather than inhabiting it. This makes the work heavier than it needs to be. You are constantly leaning forward, mentally elsewhere, imagining the version of yourself that exists after the moment arrives. That version always feels lighter, more confident, more certain, but it is an imagined self built on incomplete information. Real change is less theatrical. It does not replace uncertainty with clarity. It replaces confusion with a slightly better understanding of how things work. It replaces hesitation with familiarity. It replaces fear with tolerance. These shifts are quiet enough that they are often dismissed. People say things like, nothing has really changed, when in fact, almost everything has changed. Their standards are different. Their reactions are different. Their sense of time is different. But because these changes lack drama, they feel invisible. The overnight moment myth also hides how uneven progress actually is. People tend to share outcomes, not trajectories. They talk about the moment something worked, not the years it took to get there. This creates the illusion that success arrives suddenly, rather than gradually revealing itself. But if you trace any meaningful outcome backward, you find long stretches where nothing obvious happened, where effort continued without reinforcement, where doubt had no clear answer. Those stretches matter more than the moment that follows them. They are where skills settle, where judgment improves, where resilience develops quietly. They are where effort becomes less about hope and more about habit. The moment when it arrives is simply a consequence. Believing in overnight moments can also distort how you respond to setbacks. If progress is supposed to be sudden, then delays feel like proof that something is wrong. You start to question whether you missed your chance, whether the window closed. In reality, progress is rarely constrained to a single opportunity. It unfolds across many small adjustments. Missing one does not invalidate the others, but the myth narrows your focus. It encourages you to search for a peak instead of building a base. A base is less exciting. It does not promise revelation. It promises stability. It allows for mistakes. It absorbs pressure. It does not require perfect timing. Effort builds bases, not moments. When you let go of the idea of an overnight transformation, something subtle shifts. You stop waiting for permission to feel settled. You stop treating the present as temporary. You begin to take your current effort seriously, not because it is leading somewhere dramatic, but because it is shaping how you live now. This reduces anxiety, not because uncertainty disappears, but because it becomes less threatening. You no longer need a future event to justify your present choices. You can work without scanning the horizon constantly. This does not mean you stop hoping. Hope remains, but it becomes quieter, less urgent. It coexists with patience rather than replacing it. The overnight moment, when stripped of its myth, turns out to be something else entirely. It is not a sudden change. It is a delayed recognition, a point where internal shifts finally become visible enough to name. By the time you notice it, it has already been happening for a while. This is why people often struggle to explain their own progress. They are asked, "What changed?" and they cannot give a clear answer. There was no single decision, no dramatic breakthrough, just a series of small adjustments that accumulated quietly. That explanation sounds unsatisfying because it does not fit the story people expect, but it is more honest. Letting go of the myth does not make effort less meaningful. It makes it more accurate. You stop asking it to perform. You stop demanding that it hurry. You allow it to unfold at its own pace, and in that allowance, effort becomes easier to sustain. You no longer feel behind for not having arrived. You recognize that arrival is not a moment, but a condition, one that develops gradually and often goes unnoticed while it is forming. The overnight moment was never something to wait for. It was a story we told ourselves to make patience feel temporary. When that story loosens its grip, you are left with something quieter and more reliable. The understanding that what you are doing now matters, even if it never produces a moment worth announcing. Especially then. When work feels pointless, there are stretches of time when work loses its meaning. Not in a dramatic way. It does not collapse or fail outright. It simply stops making sense. You do what you have been doing, but the reasons that once carried you forward feel distant. The effort continues, but the connection between action and purpose weakens. This is one of the least discussed phases of any long process. When work feels pointless, it does not announce itself clearly. It arrives as a mild disorientation. You start questioning small things. Why this task? Why this pace? Why now? None of these questions demand urgent answers, but together they create a quiet erosion of certainty. Most people interpret this feeling as a sign that something is wrong, that they chose poorly, that they are wasting time, that others have figured something out that they somehow missed. These interpretations add weight to an already heavy moment, but work does not feel pointless because it has lost all value. It feels pointless because it has moved beyond novelty. The early feedback has faded. The initial excitement has done its job and stepped aside. What remains is the long, unglamorous phase where effort continues without reassurance. This phase is not an error. It is a transition. In the beginning, work often comes with built-in meaning. You are learning. You are starting. You are proving something, even if only to yourself. Progress feels visible. The work answers your questions quickly. Later, the work stops answering. It asks. It asks whether you can continue without constant affirmation, whether your reasons are strong enough to hold when they are not being refreshed daily, whether your sense of direction can survive ambiguity. This questioning can feel like emptiness, but emptiness is not the same as absence. There is still structure, still movement, still engagement. What is missing is the emotional signal that tells you, this matters. That signal was never meant to last indefinitely. Meaning is not a constant sensation. It comes and goes. It intensifies during beginnings and fades during maintenance. Expecting it to remain present at all times is like expecting motivation to be permanent. It places an unrealistic burden on the work. When work feels pointless, the temptation is to either quit or reinvent everything, to seek a dramatic shift that will restore meaning instantly. Sometimes change is necessary, but often this impulse is simply a reaction to discomfort. The discomfort comes from the loss of narrative. At first, you can explain why you are doing what you are doing. The explanation feels convincing. Over time, that explanation wears thin. It stops generating energy. You begin to feel as though you are repeating a story that no longer moves you. This does not mean the story is false. It means it needs revision. Revisions happen quietly. They require time. They cannot be rushed. In this phase, work becomes strangely intimate. Without the buffer of excitement or ambition, you are left alone with the activity itself. You notice details you once ignored. You become aware of how the work fits into your days, not just your plans. You may discover that parts of the work no longer align with you, or that parts you once dismissed are more satisfying than expected. These realizations rarely arrive as conclusions. They surface gradually through irritation and curiosity. Work feeling pointless can also be a sign that it has become normalized. What once felt meaningful now feels routine. This is not because meaning disappeared, but because it stopped standing out. Routine dulls sensation. That is its nature. The danger lies in interpreting dullness as failure. When sensation fades, people assume value has faded with it. But value does not require intensity to exist. In fact, many of the most important forms of work feel neutral most of the time. Care, maintenance, skill, responsibility. These things rarely feel inspiring on a daily basis. They matter because of their continuity, not their emotional charge. When work feels pointless, it can be helpful to notice what remains when meaning is stripped away. The structure, the skill, the relationships, the habits. These elements persist even when motivation fluctuates. They form a base. This base allows for adjustment without collapse. You can modify direction, you can change scale, you can pause and reflect, but you do not have to start from nothing. The feeling of pointlessness often peaks when effort is no longer exploratory, but not yet fully integrated. You are no longer discovering, but you are not yet settled. You are between phases, between excitement and mastery. This in-between state is uncomfortable because it lacks a clear identity. You are no longer a beginner, but you do not feel established. You have competence, but not confidence. You have history, but no clear narrative for the future. Work continues, but its meaning is under revision. This is where many people stop, not because they cannot do the work, but because they cannot tolerate the ambiguity. They want clarity before continuing. But clarity often requires continuation to emerge. Stopping can freeze the process at its most confusing point. Continuing does not guarantee clarity either, but it allows for the possibility of integration, of meaning that grows quieter and more stable, rather than louder and more fragile. When work feels pointless, it is often because you are asking it to answer a question it cannot answer alone. Questions about identity, about direction, about worth. Work can contribute to these answers, but it cannot resolve them completely. Expecting it to do so places an unfair burden on effort. It can be useful in these moments to lower the stakes internally, to stop asking whether the work justifies your life and start noticing whether it still fits within it, whether it can coexist with who you are becoming, rather than defining who you should be. This shift does not eliminate pointlessness immediately, but it softens it. It turns a judgment into an observation. Work that feels pointless is still work. It still occupies time. It still shapes attention. It still builds something, even if you cannot name it yet. Sometimes what it builds is discernment, the ability to recognize what no longer matters, the patience to sit with uncertainty without forcing resolution, the humility to admit that meaning is not always available on demand. These qualities are not dramatic. They do not feel like progress, but they are essential for any long-term engagement. Eventually, meaning returns, not as excitement, but as alignment. You notice that the work no longer feels at odds with you. It does not energize you, but it no longer drains you. It fits. That fit is subtle, easy to miss, but it is often the most reliable sign that effort has found its place. Work feeling pointless is not a failure state. It is a quiet crossroads, one that asks less about ambition and more about honesty, less about achievement and more about endurance. What you do in this phase matters, not because it produces immediate results, but because it determines whether you continue with curiosity or retreat into certainty. And curiosity, even when tired, is often enough to carry you through. Dreaming while tired. There is a version of dreaming that feels energetic and expansive. It arrives with enthusiasm. It carries momentum. It lifts you above the present and fills the future with possibility. This is the kind of dreaming people like to talk about. Then there is the other kind. Dreaming while tired is quieter. It does not come with excitement. It does not spark urgency. It exists alongside fatigue, routine, and responsibility. It does not ask for transformation. It asks for continuation. This form of dreaming is rarely acknowledged because it does not look impressive. It does not announce itself as ambition. It feels more like a background awareness, a sense that something still matters, even when energy is low. Tired dreaming does not imagine dramatic change. It imagines sustainability. When you are tired, your mind becomes more selective. It cannot entertain every possibility. It narrows focus. It pays attention to what feels necessary rather than what feels impressive. In this way, tiredness strips dreams down to their essentials. This can feel discouraging at first. Dreams lose their sparkle. They no longer offer escape. They feel closer to reality, which means they also feel heavier. But this closeness is not a flaw. It is a form of honesty. When energy is high, it is easy to imagine futures that ignore limits. When energy is low, limits become visible. You can no longer pretend you have infinite time or attention. You are forced to ask different questions. What can I actually maintain? What can I carry forward without breaking? What still matters when I am not at my best? These questions reshape dreams. Dreaming while tired is not about pushing through exhaustion. It is about letting exhaustion inform ambition. It allows dreams to adjust to the actual conditions of your life, rather than the ideal ones. This adjustment often feels like a loss. Dreams become smaller, slower, less exciting, but they also become more durable. A dream that survives tiredness is a dream that can last. There is a common belief that dreaming requires energy, that without enthusiasm, imagination fades. In reality, imagination does not disappear when energy drops. It becomes more focused, less playful perhaps, but more deliberate. Tired dreaming does not wander, it stays close. It attaches itself to habits rather than fantasies. It aligns with what you already do rather than what you hope to become overnight. It respects your current capacity instead of demanding more. This is why tired dreams often feel modest. They do not promise reinvention. They promise improvement at a human pace. For many people, this is the first time their dreams become truly personal. Stripped of performance and external expectation, what remains is something quieter but more honest. You may notice that tired dreams rarely ask you to do more. They ask you to do differently, to simplify, to prioritize, to let go of unnecessary strain. This shift can feel like settling, but it is often a form of wisdom. When energy is limited, you become aware of trade-offs. Every yes requires a no. Every addition adds weight. Dreams begin to account for this reality. They stop pretending that growth is free. This does not make them less ambitious. It makes them more grounded. Dreaming while tired also changes your relationship with time. High-energy dreams often imagine quick progress. They compress the future. They assume that momentum will carry you through. Tired dreams stretch time out. They imagine slow accumulation. They assume pauses. They build in rest. This makes them less thrilling, but more survivable. There is also a gentler emotional tone to tired dreaming. It is less demanding, less critical. You are less likely to judge yourself harshly for not moving faster. You accept the current pace as information rather than failure. This acceptance creates a strange kind of relief. Without the pressure to be constantly improving, dreams become companions rather than demands. They walk alongside your life instead of pulling you away from it. This companionship matters during long stretches of effort. When progress is uneven, when results are unclear, when life requires attention in many directions at once. Dreams that can coexist with tiredness do not disappear during hard weeks. They remain present, even if faint. They do not require daily enthusiasm to stay alive. These dreams are often the ones that last. There is a vulnerability in dreaming while tired. Without energy to shield you, doubts feel closer. You are more aware of limitations. You may worry that tiredness means decline. That reduced ambition signals something wrong. But tiredness is not always a sign of failure. Sometimes it is simply the result of sustained engagement, of having been present for a long time. In these moments, dreaming does not need to reignite excitement. It needs to remain gentle enough to stay. This gentleness is not weakness. It is adaptation. Dreaming while tired also reveals which dreams were dependent on mood. Those dreams fade quickly when energy drops. They were fueled by excitement rather than commitment. What remains after tiredness sets in is more reliable, less dramatic, more integrated. These remaining dreams may not feel like dreams at all. They may feel like preferences, like quiet intentions, like a general direction rather than a destination. But direction is often more useful than destination. A destination promises arrival. Direction allows movement without urgency. When you dream while tired, you stop chasing arrival. You focus on alignment, on whether the path you are on still makes sense given your current capacity. This focus reduces internal conflict. You are no longer fighting your own limits. You are working with them. Over time, this creates a different relationship with effort. Effort becomes less about proving something and more about maintaining something fragile but meaningful. Dreams that survive tiredness tend to be realistic about cost. They acknowledge that effort takes energy, that rest is not optional, that sustainability matters. These dreams may never be loud, they may never demand attention, but they tend to guide behavior quietly and consistently. You notice them in small choices, in what you protect when time is scarce, in what you return to after rest. Dreaming while tired does not ask you to be inspired. It asks you to be honest. It allows dreams to grow up, to shed their need for constant excitement, to settle into a form that can live alongside responsibility, uncertainty, and limited energy. This kind of dreaming does not feel triumphant. It feels steady, and steadiness, over time, carries more weight than enthusiasm ever could. The slow accumulation of skill. Skill rarely arrives with a clear beginning. You do not wake up one day and decide to acquire it in full. Instead, it slips into your life gradually, almost unnoticed. You repeat an action, you make a mistake, you adjust, you repeat again. Somewhere in that quiet loop, skill begins to form. This process is slow enough that it often feels invisible. Especially in the early stages, nothing seems to change. You put in time, but the results look the same. Your output feels clumsy. Your understanding feels partial. You wonder whether what you are doing is actually working. This doubt is not a sign of failure. It is a natural response to gradual progress. Skill does not announce itself because it is built through small corrections rather than dramatic improvements. Each repetition carries a tiny adjustment. Each error teaches something subtle. These changes accumulate quietly below the level of daily awareness. That is what makes skill difficult to trust while it is forming. In the beginning, effort feels heavier than ability. You are aware of everything you do not know. Every task requires concentration. Every decision feels tentative. You are constantly comparing what you intend to do with what actually happens. This gap can feel discouraging. You see the distance between where you are and where you want to be, and that distance feels fixed. It does not shrink visibly from day to day. But the gap is deceptive. It narrows sideways before it narrows forward. You begin to notice patterns. Mistakes repeat themselves in recognizable ways. Problems start to look familiar rather than overwhelming. You do not solve them faster yet, but you recognize them sooner. This recognition is the first quiet sign of skill. Skill changes how you perceive difficulty. What once felt chaotic begins to feel structured. You understand where effort should be placed. You stop wasting energy on irrelevant details. You begin to sense what matters, even before you can fully explain why. This sensing does not feel impressive. It feels tentative. You second guess it. You hesitate to trust it because it is not yet consistent. But consistency comes later. The slow accumulation of skill requires patience, not just with the task, but with yourself. You must tolerate periods where effort outpaces visible improvement, where you feel stuck even as you are learning. Many people abandon skill building at this stage, not because they lack ability, but because they misinterpret stillness as stagnation. Skill often develops in plateaus, long stretches where nothing seems to change, followed by sudden clarity. These moments of clarity can feel like breakthroughs, but they are simply the visible result of accumulated understanding. The work was happening all along. During these plateaus, repetition can feel pointless. You repeat the same actions, confront the same challenges, and receive no obvious reward. Motivation fades. Curiosity dulls. You begin to wonder whether you should try something else. This is where skill quietly tests commitment. Not through intensity, but through endurance. Those who continue during these flat periods are not necessarily more passionate. They are more tolerant of ambiguity. They accept that learning is not always stimulating, that growth is not always felt in real time. They allow repetition to do its work. Repetition is often misunderstood as mindless. In reality, it is where refinement happens. Each repetition gives you another opportunity to notice small differences, to experiment with timing, with pressure, with sequence. Over time, these experiments settle into instinct. Instinct is simply practice judgment. When skill reaches this stage, effort feels lighter. Not because the task has become easy, but because decisions are made faster. You no longer deliberate over every step. You trust your sense of what to do next. This trust is fragile at first. It wavers under pressure. It collapses when you are tired, but it returns more quickly each time. This returning is another quiet sign of skill. Skill also changes your relationship with mistakes. Early on, mistakes feel personal. They feel like evidence of inadequacy. You focus on them intensely. You replay them. You worry about them. As skill accumulates, mistakes lose their emotional weight. They become information. You notice them, adjust, and move on. You no longer need to protect your ego from them because they no longer define you. This emotional shift matters more than technical improvement. It allows you to stay engaged without constant self-judgment. It makes learning sustainable. The slow accumulation of skill is often lonely. It does not generate external validation. There are no clear milestones to celebrate. Progress is subtle and internal. This can feel discouraging in a world that values visibility, where improvement is expected to be obvious, where learning is often packaged as rapid transformation. But real skill resists packaging. It develops through quiet attention, through mistakes that never get shared, through hours that look identical from the outside but feel slightly different from the inside. Those slight differences matter. They add up. One day, you realize that something that once demanded effort now happens automatically. You do not remember when the change occurred. You cannot point to a specific moment. It simply became normal. This normalization is the result of accumulation. Skill does not replace effort. It reshapes it. Effort becomes more focused, less scattered. You know where to apply it and where not to. This efficiency can look like talent from the outside. People assume you are naturally good at something. They do not see the repetition behind it. They see the smoothness, not the friction that produced it. But you remember the friction. This memory keeps you grounded. It prevents complacency. It reminds you that skill can fade if neglected, that it requires maintenance, even after it is formed. Skill is not a permanent achievement. It is a condition that must be sustained. This realization can feel unsettling. You may wish that once earned, skill would remain indefinitely, but its impermanence is part of what keeps it alive. It encourages continued engagement, continued attention. The slow accumulation of skill teaches patience in a way few other processes do. It forces you to operate without constant feedback, to trust that effort is doing something, even when you cannot see it. This trust does not come easily. It is built alongside the skill itself. Over time, you learn to recognize the signs. Subtle improvements in judgment, fewer unnecessary corrections, a calmer response to difficulty. These signs do not demand celebration. They offer reassurance. Skill accumulates quietly, but its effects are profound. It changes how you move through tasks, how you respond to challenges, how you understand your own capacity. It does not transform you overnight. It reshapes you gradually. And because it is gradual, it tends to last. The slow accumulation of skill is not glamorous. It does not promise excitement. It asks for patience, tolerance, and repetition. But it offers something rare, a sense of quiet competence that does not need to prove itself, a steadiness that comes from having lived inside the work long enough to understand it. That understanding is earned slowly. And once earned, it stays with you, shaping effort long after the initial struggle has been forgotten. Work that changes the worker. Work does not only produce results, it produces people. This is easy to forget because outcomes are easier to measure than internal shifts. You can point to a finished task, a completed project, a visible achievement. You cannot point as easily to the quieter changes that happen along the way, the ones that settle into your habits, your reactions, your sense of self. But these changes are often the most lasting. When you begin any kind of sustained work, you usually focus on what it will lead to, what it will give you, what it might fix or improve. You imagine the future version of yourself that exists after the work has done its job. What you rarely imagine is how the work itself will shape you while you are doing it. At first, this shaping is subtle. You adapt your schedule. You adjust your attention. You learn how to manage small frustrations so you can continue. These adaptations feel temporary, like tools you are borrowing for a specific purpose. Over time, they become part of you. You notice that your tolerance has increased, that you are less reactive to setbacks, that you can stay with discomfort longer without panicking. These changes do not feel dramatic. They feel practical, useful. They also go mostly unnoticed. Work teaches you how to spend time. It shows you whether you rush, avoid, obsess, or drift. It reveals patterns that were always there, but never tested so consistently. When you work at something over a long period, these patterns have nowhere to hide. This exposure can be uncomfortable. You may realize that you are impatient in certain situations, that you avoid tasks that lack immediate payoff, that you rely on urgency to move forward. These realizations are not judgments. They are information. Work does not criticize you. It reflects you. As effort continues, you begin to respond differently. Not because you decided to change, but because repetition reshapes behavior. You learn what does not work through experience rather than theory. You stop making the same mistakes as often. You recover from them faster. This is not improvement in the dramatic sense. It is refinement. Work also changes how you think about progress. Early on, progress feels external. You measure it by milestones and outcomes. Later, you start noticing internal markers. How calmly you handle complexity. How little you need reassurance to continue. How well you understand the limits of your own energy. These internal markers matter more than external ones because they travel with you. Even if the work changes, these capacities remain. They become transferable. You carry them into new contexts without effort. This is why people who have worked deeply at one thing often adapt more easily to another. They are not starting from zero. They are bringing a way of engaging with difficulty that has already been shaped. Work also alters your sense of time. At first, you think in terms of deadlines and duration, how long something will take, when it will be done. Over time, your attention shifts to rhythm, pace, sustainability. You begin to notice when you're pushing too hard, not because someone tells you to stop, but because the quality of your attention declines. You learn to recognize the early signs of fatigue. You adjust before things break. This awareness is learned, not taught. It comes from living inside effort long enough to feel its consequences. Work also changes your relationship with control. In the beginning, you often try to manage everything. You plan extensively. You anticipate problems. You try to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. As experience accumulates, you accept that uncertainty cannot be eliminated. You become more comfortable responding rather than predicting. You trust your ability to adapt. This trust reduces anxiety, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because you have evidence that you can handle variation. Work teaches you humility in this way. It shows you what is within your control and what is not. It makes this distinction tangible. Another quiet change occurs in how you evaluate yourself. Early on, self-worth can feel closely tied to performance. Success feels affirming. Failure feels personal. As work continues, this link loosens. You see enough variation in outcomes to understand that performance fluctuates, that effort does not always produce the same results, that external factors matter. This understanding protects you from extremes. You no longer inflate your identity with success or diminish it with difficulty. You become steadier. This steadiness is not indifference, it is perspective. Work also shapes how you relate to others. You become more patient with different paces, more aware of unseen effort, less quick to judge. Having experienced the gap between effort and recognition yourself, you recognize it in others. You respect consistency even when it is quiet. You understand that competence often looks ordinary. This understanding deepens relationships. It replaces comparison with curiosity. There is also a cost to work that changes you. You may outgrow certain expectations. You may lose interest in things that once mattered. You may become less impressed by shortcuts and more appreciative of depth. These shifts can create distance, not because you are better, but because you are different. Work does not always make you lighter. Sometimes it makes you heavier, more aware, more selective, less easily entertained. This heaviness is not a flaw. It is the weight of understanding. Over time, work leaves traces in your language, in how you explain things, in how carefully you choose words. You become less inclined to oversimplify, less comfortable with certainty that has not been tested. You speak with more pauses, more nuance. This is another way work reshapes you. It slows you down. Slowness is often mistaken for hesitation. In reality, it can be a sign of depth. You have seen enough to know that quick answers are rarely complete. Work also changes what you fear. Early fears tend to be about failure and exposure. Later fears are quieter, about stagnation, about misalignment, about investing energy in something that no longer fits. These fears are more subtle, but also more informative. They guide adjustments rather than triggering panic. By the time work has changed you significantly, you may barely notice it happening. You look back and realize that your reactions are different. Your expectations are different. Your patience is different. You are different. This change was not planned. It was not a goal. It emerged as a byproduct of sustained engagement. And unlike outcomes, it cannot be taken away easily. Projects end, results fade, circumstances shift, but the person shaped by work remains. carrying habits, perspectives, and capacities that did not exist before. This is why work matters even when outcomes disappoint, even when recognition does not arrive, even when the future remains uncertain. Because work is not only something you do, it is something that quietly does something to you. And often that something is more valuable than whatever you were originally working toward. Dreams that no longer need proof. In the beginning, dreams often ask for evidence. They want signs that they are reasonable, that they are progressing, that they are worth the effort they require. Without proof, they feel fragile. You protect them with explanations. You justify them to yourself and to others. This need for proof is understandable. Early dreams are uncertain. They exist mostly in imagination. They have not yet earned trust through experience. Proof becomes a way to quiet doubt. Over time, something shifts. After enough effort, after enough adjustment, after enough quiet endurance, some dreams stop asking to be verified. They no longer depend on external confirmation to feel real. They settle into you as something assumed rather than defended. This is not because they have been achieved. Often, they have not. It is because they have been lived with long enough to feel familiar. Dreams that no longer need proof are different from goals. Goals are evaluated, they are measured. They either happen or they do not. Dreams, at this stage, become orientation rather than destination. They guide behavior quietly. They influence choices without demanding attention. You may notice this when you stop explaining yourself as much, when you no longer feel the urge to justify why you are doing what you are doing. The reasons have not disappeared. They have simply moved inward. This inward shift brings relief. Without the need to prove anything, effort becomes less tense. You are no longer performing belief. You are living it. You do not need to convince yourself daily that the dream matters. It is already embedded in how you spend time and energy. This does not make the dream smaller. It makes it steadier. Earlier dreams often rely on visibility. They want to be seen, acknowledged, validated. Later dreams are comfortable being private. They do not lose strength in silence. They gain it. Privacy protects them. When a dream is no longer fragile, it can tolerate doubt. It can survive periods of inactivity. It can coexist with uncertainty without collapsing. It does not require constant reassurance to stay alive. This tolerance is a sign of maturity, not complacency. Dreams that need proof are often driven by urgency. They feel like they are racing against time. They demand progress to justify their existence. Dreams that no longer need proof are less rushed. They understand that time is part of the process, not an enemy. This changes how you experience delay. Delays no longer feel like threats. They feel like part of the rhythm. You adjust rather than panic. You trust that movement can slow without stopping entirely. This trust does not come from optimism. It comes from familiarity. You have seen yourself continue before. You have seen effort resume after interruptions. You have lived through enough cycles to know that momentum can be rebuilt. That knowledge becomes internal proof. At this stage, dreams often become simpler to describe, even if they are harder to explain. You might use fewer words. You might choose less impressive language. The dream no longer needs to sound convincing. It only needs to feel true. This simplicity can be misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like ambition has faded. That intensity has been replaced by indifference. But the opposite is often true. The dream has moved closer to the core. It no longer needs to announce itself because it is no longer negotiating its place in your life. It belongs there. There is also a quiet confidence that comes with this shift. Not confidence in outcome, but confidence in direction. You are less anxious about whether the dream will unfold exactly as imagined. You are more interested in whether you are moving in a way that feels aligned. Alignment replaces assurance. This does not eliminate disappointment. Things still fail. Plans still change. But disappointment no longer threatens the dream itself. It affects a layer, not the foundation. Dreams that no longer need proof can survive disappointment without becoming bitter. They adapt without losing their essence. Another subtle change occurs in how you respond to comparison. Earlier dreams often invite comparison. You measure progress against others. You look for signs that you are ahead or behind. Later dreams loosen this habit. Comparison feels less relevant. Other people's timelines no longer define yours. Their success does not invalidate your path. This is not because you have stopped caring. It is because your reference point has shifted. You are no longer asking whether your dream is impressive enough. You are asking whether it still fits. Fit is quieter than success, but more sustainable. Dreams that no longer need proof also tend to be kinder. They place fewer demands on you. They allow for rest. They recognize limits. They do not interpret exhaustion as failure. This kindness does not weaken them. It strengthens their longevity. You stop pushing yourself to prove commitment through suffering. You allow consistency to speak instead. You let small, repeated choices accumulate without fanfare. This accumulation is enough. There is a freedom in no longer needing to be seen striving. You can work without narrating it. You can pause without explaining it. You can change direction slightly without defending the adjustment. The dream remains intact because it no longer depends on a specific image of success. At this point, dreams often feel less like something you are chasing and more like something you are carrying. They are part of how you move through the world. They influence tone, priority, and attention. They do not ask to be completed. They ask to be lived with. This can feel anticlimactic if you expected dreams to culminate in a defining moment, but it is also deeply stabilizing. You no longer wait for the dream to start your life. It is already there, shaping it quietly. Dreams that no longer need proof are not passive. They still require effort, but the effort feels less dramatic, less charged, more integrated. You are no longer working to justify the dream. You are working because the work itself makes sense within it. This is a subtle but profound shift. It marks the moment when dreaming stops being an act of imagination and becomes a way of being. The dream does not stand apart from your life anymore. It is woven into it. And because of that, it does not need to be proven. It simply needs to be carried forward in whatever form it continues to take. Ending without a finish line. There is a quiet tension in the way people think about endings. We expect them to close something cleanly, to resolve uncertainty, to mark a clear transition from effort to rest, from striving to arrival. An ending, in this sense, is meant to prove that the work was worth it. But most meaningful processes do not end that way. They taper, they soften, they change shape. They continue under different names. An ending without a finish line feels unsatisfying at first. There is no moment of certainty, no signal that you are done, no clear point where you can step back and say, this is complete. Instead, you find yourself slowing down, adjusting, carrying pieces forward without a clear boundary. This can feel like a failure of closure, but it is often a sign of integration. When effort and dreaming have been part of your life for long enough, they stop behaving like projects. They stop asking to be completed. They become conditions, ways of engaging with the world that do not switch off just because a chapter closes. In this sense, an ending is not a conclusion. It is a change in emphasis. The intensity may lessen, the urgency may fade, but the underlying orientation remains. You still notice what matters. You still invest attention. You still imagine forward, even if more quietly than before. The idea of a finish line suggests competition, a race with winners and losers, a clear before and after. This framing works for events, but not for lives. Lives do not move in straight lines. They loop, they pause, they revisit, they abandon some paths and return to others later. A finish line would imply that all of this movement could be reduced to a single outcome. It cannot. When you let go of the finish line, effort changes character. You no longer push toward a distant point. You focus on maintaining balance, on adjusting pace, on staying responsive rather than driven. This does not mean effort disappears. It means it becomes less rigid. Dreaming changes as well. Without a finish line, dreams stop insisting on arrival. They stop measuring worth through completion. They become ongoing companions rather than destinations. This can feel disorienting if you're used to defining yourself by what you are working toward. Without a clear endpoint, identity feels less solid. You are no longer the person who is almost there. You are simply the person who is continuing. This continuation requires a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence of achievement, but the confidence of orientation. You trust that your way of engaging with effort and dreaming has value, even without a concluding moment. This trust is quieter. It does not need to be celebrated. Ending without a finish line also changes how you relate to rest. Rest is no longer a reward for completion. It becomes a necessary part of continuation. You rest not because you are done, but because you intend to keep going in some form. This reframing removes guilt from rest. It allows pauses without the pressure to justify them. Rest becomes maintenance rather than indulgence. Maintenance is not exciting, but it is what allows things to last. There is also a gentler acceptance that comes with this kind of ending. You stop expecting clarity to arrive all at once. You accept that understanding accumulates slowly and incompletely, that some questions remain open. Open questions are not unfinished work. They are part of being alive. Without a finish line, success becomes harder to define. It no longer fits neatly into categories. It becomes personal, contextual, fluid. This ambiguity can feel uncomfortable, but it also allows honesty. You are no longer required to present your life as a story with a clear arc. You can acknowledge complexity without apologizing for it. Ending without a finish line also softens regret. When there is no final outcome to measure against, there is less temptation to calculate what might have been. You still reflect, you still adjust, but you do not frame everything as a missed opportunity. You see choices as part of a continuous process rather than decisive moments that fixed your fate. This perspective is forgiving. It allows you to carry forward what was useful and release what no longer fits, without turning either into a verdict on your character. As effort and dreaming continue in quieter forms, you may notice that you speak about them differently, less in terms of goals and more in terms of habits, less about ambition and more about care. Care is not dramatic, it does not announce itself, but it sustains things over time. Caring about how you work, caring about how you imagine the future, caring about how these elements interact with the rest of your life. This is what remains when the finish line dissolves. Ending without a finish line also allows gratitude to surface naturally. Not gratitude for achieving something specific, but gratitude for having been engaged, for having invested attention, for having learned how to stay with something long enough to be changed by it. This gratitude is quiet. It does not require celebration. It settles in as a background warmth. You do not need to declare the journey complete to feel that it mattered. In fact, declaring it complete might diminish it. It would imply that its value depended on an ending rather than on the way it shaped your days. Without a finish line, you are free to continue differently, to carry forward what remains meaningful and set aside what has served its purpose, to begin new cycles without discarding the old ones entirely. This continuity is not stagnant. It evolves. It adapts. It stays alive by changing. An ending without a finish line is not an absence of direction. It is a refusal to compress a life into a single result. It acknowledges that effort and dreaming are ongoing conversations. They pause. They resume. They take new forms. But they do not resolve completely. And that is not a flaw. It is an honest reflection of how people actually live. You end not by arriving, but by continuing with more awareness, less urgency, more patience. You carry forward what matters without demanding that it justify itself through completion. This is not a triumphant ending. It is a settled one. A quiet understanding that the absence of a finish line does not diminish the journey. It allows it to remain open.